So hello, everybody. My name is Natalie de la Torre Salas. And like you mentioned, I work for the Florida Public Archaeology Network here in the Southwest region. And although I am the one presenting today, this work has been possible by the support and work of my colleagues, Sarah Ayers-Rigsby from FPAN as well, and Charlie Cobb and Michelle Lefay from the Florida Museum of Natural History, and Anissa Karim from the Rundell Research Center. So I'm very excited to present at the summit for the very first time, but mostly because I get to show another side of the impact of Hurricane Ian on Southwest Florida that has not been discussed yet at the summit, which is the impact of climate change and intense hurricanes to our heritage. And by this, I mean heritage in all of its manifestations, right? Cultural heritage, natural heritage, movable, immovable, tangible, or intangible, okay? So in this presentation, I'm not going to go into detail on every part of this disaster risk management plan for this particular archaeological site, but rather explain the first steps involved in creating the draft, the ongoing recovery activities for the site following Hurricane Ian, and applying lessons learned from Hurricane Ian to the site's overall heritage management. Let's see if I, no. There we go. Don't know which one is, but I'll figure it out. So what is the Pineland Archaeological Site Complex? So Southwest Florida's Pine Island is home to the Pineland Site Complex, which is an outstanding archaeological site made up of 7 archaeological sites overall that are understood to have been one of the major towns of the native indigenous people known as the Calusa. So this area was distinguished by 2 sizable shell mounds, and shell mounds are intentional earthwork that would have been made in the past, not to be confused with middens, which are prehistoric trash piles. And though they were divided by a water court and an artificial central canal as well. And at the Pineland site, there are still a few historic buildings as well that illustrate Florida's early pioneer past. And the public can actually go and enjoy this site through the Calusa Heritage Trail, which is a publicly accessible walking trail in the Rundell Research Center, who manages the site. So it's pretty much a 1 mile approximately interpretative walkway that gives you access to the canals, to the mounds, and other features of the archaeological site. And like I mentioned, the site is currently managed by Rundell and is designated as a county historical resource, and is also on the National Register of Historic Places. And not only because it's such an incredible archaeological and historical site with much value, but also because it's home to an incredible amount of biodiversity as well. So, okay. So the previous knowledge that I had about the Rundell Research Center and how they, dealt with hurricanes came from the current staff's accounts of their experience with Hurricane Charlie back in 2004. But as we know, Ian was bigger, it moved slower, and thus brought in more rain, which means that the flooding was more intense and caused incredible damage and loss of lives and property. So Pine Island Sound and Estero Bay were ground zero for the storm. So making it the state's deadliest storm since 1935, which is known as the Labor Day hurricane. So I put this question forward: can we call Hurricane Ian a disaster? And the answer is yes. When we think and speak about the aftermath of Hurricane Ian, we can certainly call it a disaster. However, there is no such thing as a natural disaster. And at this point, you might be like, where is she going with this? Because we all call it natural disasters, right? Haha, prepare for listening to me talk about how they're not. So disasters are long-term, slow-moving social processes, okay? And these are the official definitions by the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. They define disaster as a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or a society at any scale due to a hazardous event. And on the other hand, an emergency is sometimes used interchangeably with the term disaster. However, it can also relate to hazardous events that do not result in the serious disruption of a community or a society. So disasters are caused by human decisions, choices, and activities that create vulnerabilities, okay? And also calling them natural pretty much assumes that there is nothing that we can do about them. And that is completely wrong, okay? So we must hold our politicians and public policy makers accountable. And that's why language also matters, okay? So we must remember that campaigns like the No More Natural Disasters are trying to address this problem. And every single one of us here has a role to play before and after a disaster occurs, especially when protecting ourselves, and in the context of this presentation, how we protect our heritage as well. And again, heritage is also our watersheds on our landscapes. So a disaster can happen where a society or community exists. So if we were on a deserted island and a hurricane like Ian would have passed through, we wouldn't be calling it a disaster, right? There's no people to consider it a disaster. So one of the terrible things, again, of using the word natural to describe disasters is that it misleads people to think that devastating results are inevitable, out of our control, and are simply a part of a natural process. So it is hazards like earthquakes, fires, and flooding that are inevitable, but the impact they have on society is not. And this is something that we have clearly seen in this year's summit presentations as we talk about vulnerability assessments and how to increase our resilience to different hazards and disasters. So again, referring to disasters as natural obscures the fact that we as a society play a role in producing them. And as a result, disasters can function as mirrors of how societies work. And we can question the way that we do things. So Hurricane Ian undoubtedly had an impact on the Pineland Archaeological Site Complex, as evidenced by the images here taken by great colleague Anissa Karim at the Randell Research Center. The first image is the entrance to the Calusa Heritage Trail. Again, is the way that the public has to enjoy this archaeological site. It limited the access for anyone to check in on the site right after Ian happened. We also see from the images uprooted trees and other debris, which are frequently the main sources of damage to archaeological mounds, which are immovable, right? We cannot grab a mound and put it in a storage unit. We have to leave them there no matter what. And on the second and third image, we can see this happening on top of Brown's Mound, how even the structures and the stairs leading to the mound were also completely damaged and in some part destroyed. So how do we decide how to prepare an archaeological site or a historical cemetery for a hazardous event or a disaster? So this is when we start talking about creating a disaster risk management plan for cultural heritage. And a DRM plan is a tool for taking proactive measures to prevent or minimize the potential impacts on cultural heritage due to catastrophic hazards that may become a disaster. So now the work for creating this disaster risk management plan for Pineland actually started all the way back in August of 2022, when I had the incredible opportunity of participating from the international training course on disaster risk management of cultural heritage by Ritsumeikan University in Kyoto, Japan, which was in collaboration with ICROM. And for those of you who are not familiar, ICROM is the International Center for the Study of the Preservation and Restoration of Cultural Property. So actually the field of disaster risk management of cultural heritage is pretty new. So I would not be surprised if this is like a brand new concept for many of you. And people started having these conversations about disasters and heritage right after 2005, the earthquake in Kobe, Japan hit. And there was this conference on disaster reduction held there. And they said, okay, heritage must be a part of this conversation when we're talking about climate change and when we're talking about disasters, no? So this course was a result from that conference. And part of it was to do, in the end, a disaster risk management plan for a site. And that's when I decided to reach out to my colleagues at the Randell Research Center and the Florida Museum of Natural History, and they were on board. So I'm very happy that they decided to allow me to have this opportunity. So doing this would also be very helpful for them, since they currently only have an emergency plan and a management plan from 2012 that only focuses on the protection of electronics, collections, books, and furniture, but not on potential hazards and disasters that may impact the actual archaeological site. So the first thing that I had to do was make a risk assessment for the archaeological site. But why do we need a risk assessment for a heritage site, a museum, or a historical cemetery even? So this is not a guessing game, and we are making an informed judgment on nature of risks to the heritage site. And a risk assessment helps in setting the goals of that disaster risk management plan. So the risk assessment is composed of the primary and secondary hazards, the vulnerabilities, the attributes, and also very important, the heritage values of the site, okay? So as you can see, that is just a condensed table with all of that information. We have the primary hazards that may impact Southwest Florida. The secondary hazards is what would happen after that initial impact by a primary hazard, the current vulnerabilities that we are facing, particularly within the context of that site, our attributes, and see, right, if there is impact to an archaeological mound, will the loss of value be high? In this case, yes, because we would be losing a few of the Calusa mounds that we still have left in Southwest Florida. So heritage attributes are the elements of a heritage place which convey its heritage values and enable an understanding of those values. Because Pineland is such a big site, it was easier for me to divide all of the heritage attributes into three main categories. So first category is the built. So that entails the teaching pavilion that was built in 2004. And this is very interesting because that teaching pavilion was made to withstand hurricane winds of 150 miles per hour. And also Ruby Gill House, which is a historical pioneer house that was functioning at the time as the headquarters for Randell Research Center. We also have the landscape, which is obviously the Calusa Heritage Trail, but also the Ibis Pond, which is, if you go there and walk, it's this beautiful pond out there. And archaeological, obviously all the many mounds and artifacts that have come out of the site. And management at, So as we have seen and learned at the summit, the climate projections for the future are showing us that hurricane season is going to be more intense, as well as other weather events. So it is also important to understand that our shared histories and important cultural sites will also be affected by climate change, right? And again, why do we care about heritage values? It is a reason why a heritage place is considered important enough to be protected for present and future generations. And the management at Pineland has to ask themselves how to maintain the place's attributes and make sure that those values are protected. And values change depending on people's perspective. So protecting this heritage place has to be a participatory process. And that is why it was also necessary to create a stakeholder analysis. And this figure shows all the people that have a direct relationship or interact with Pineland Archaeological site, which are the people from Randell Research Center and the Florida Museum. So staff, volunteers, etc. Also local and state stakeholders, universities, businesses and organizations, and of course, donors. So knowing this will help better manage the site because it will help you identify the different people who will be involved in the different steps of responding to an emergency or that can take place in your overall disaster risk management plan. So not even the worst disaster scenario can prepare you 100% for the outcomes of a disaster, which is why firsthand experiences should be discussed and applied to a disaster risk management plan. And when making a draft plan for Pineland's, archaeological site, I decided to base it on a worst case scenario. And granted, as someone who I pride myself in having a level of anxiety that allows me to think of every possible worst case scenario, I said, I got this. So when I was talking to my colleagues and all the people, over Zoom that were in different countries, I was like, well, I imagine my site's worst case scenario being a hurricane category 5 in mid-September, peak of hurricane season in Southwest Florida, mounds destroyed, artifacts destroyed. Okay. So granted, when September happened, I felt like Nostradamus because my worst case disaster scenario came true and not in a good way. I never accounted for the Matlacha Bridge to collapse. In fact, in my original draft plan, I had written, in case the staff from Randell Research Center cannot make it to the site after a hurricane, the Florida Public Archaeology Network will be there. I will be there because I live nearby. No, I had to evacuate. So I was not there. So that was a reality that we had to confront and be like, okay. So my plan, again, originally had that. And however, we had to come back and think, how can we apply these lessons learned, right? So with this experience, it was clear that, again, we needed to apply lessons learned from Ian's experience, as well as with Hurricane Charlie back in 2004. And so from May to June, we intend to include lessons such as incorporate other hazards to the plan, like fires, we also have started to discuss dividing the property into zones or sectors for storm preparation and for post-storm assessments. So designating a meeting point and a communication system for staff as well. So I don't know if any of you happened that after the storm, you couldn't get in touch with your colleagues, right, and coworkers. And the first thing after a disaster is like, are you okay, right? So because of that, we are also talking about conducting staff and volunteer storm training meeting once per year to refresh everyone's memories and roles and responses that will be detailed in this disaster risk management plan. So we will also add information on contractors before the disaster happens. So that was another thing that was very shocking, is to find out who are the contractors out there that can help us clean up the site and help us rebuild, especially when all the resources are running thin, especially in the Malache area, right? Which was, again, ground zero for the hurricane. And we are also talking about acquiring staff and volunteers' secondary phone numbers and addresses so we can make sure that they are all safe. So this figure shows the disaster management spiral, which illustrates the two main phases of disaster management. And it shows them as a pre-disaster risk reduction and post-disaster risk recovery. And we are currently in the reconstruction phase of the post-disaster recovery. And how this looks in the context of Pineland Archaeological site and the Randell Research Center is that they decided to use a three-pronged strategy. So first of all, they decided to seek funding from the National Science Foundation, an emergency grant to assess the damage to Pineland and other major Calusa sites in the region. We're also preparing and going back to the site and clean up and open back the trails has been also main focus, and also exploring FEMA funds and university grants to further help those rebuilding efforts. So in addition to working on updating an overall management plan for Pineland, that includes a disaster risk management plan for cultural heritage. As a result from this work, there are now other goals in our ongoing recovery phase. So first is to share the knowledge, share everything learned at this international training course, not only with the people at the Randell Research Center, but other partners and colleagues and wonderful people like you. Also continue to share with the public the ways heritage sites are recovering from the aftermath of Hurricane Ian. So public awareness is a big thing as well. And start a process of networking and negotiating with civil protection groups, such as the County Sheriff's Department, to host training on how to care for cultural resources. Often the first people to go to an archaeological site or heritage site after a disaster is the fire police, the sheriff's office, and they're not trained on how to deal with heritage. And cultural heritage, just like people, needs first aid. So my key summary and key takeaways, I should have written there very big: no natural disasters. And if you're a scientist or dedicate yourself to science communication, I hope you really reflect on this and consider never calling a disaster natural again. But yes, one of the things that definitely taken out of this is that we need to invest time and resources in constructing buildings resistant to hurricanes. And again, this was the case with the teaching pavilion, which definitely withstood the impact of Hurricane Ian. It is critical as well to document hurricane impacts on archaeological sites, and this is key for creating risk assessment maps and better protect our heritage in Southwest Florida. And a disaster risk management plan can better help site managers. And again, site managers for parks or natural sites that also have a heritage or cultural heritage component. And this is not only site managers, but also staff. This will help them prepare and respond to disasters by creating a clear chain of command, right? And practice. When it's time to act, know those roles are clear and everybody knows what they're supposed to do and how they're going to contact each other and what are the different steps to take to make sure that to mitigate those risks and reduce disaster risks. And this is all, again, basing them on different hazards and on different disaster scenarios. And mitigation measures need to be optimized, not maximized, to achieve best results for a cultural resource. And this requires a balancing act between the protection of heritage values and other priorities and constraints. And most importantly, it requires a proactive action. So we definitely do need to document and do more public outreach on the impact of climate change on immovable heritage like archaeological mounds and other heritage overall. And last but not least, recovery from a disaster is not a plan, but rather it is a process. Muchas gracias.
I don't know about you, but I was just so struck about how the same principles that you went about and kind of processing, preparation, post-storm assessment, it really is echoed in other types of resources we're trying to protect, or key assets as well. So there's a lot of commonality here, but it was also interesting to hear it in that context, which was really a fresh perspective. So thank you. We have some questions coming up. It says, does Pine Island need another bridge? I don't know if you have an opinion on that one. I think they did repair it. Did they not?
Yeah, they did. They put a temporary bridge. And at this moment, I don't know what the county's plan is in regards to that bridge, to be honest. But I'm glad that they worked as fast as they could to make that temporary bridge and make sure to assist people that needed the help the most after Hurricane Ian.
Yes. And then what are the plans for sea level rise for the site?
Oh, that's a great, a new question. That's a great question. So the plans for sea level rise for the site. So this is the part when it's very important to document the impact of different hazards and overall climate change on archaeological sites, because it can inform making plans, for example, for assessing sea level rise. At the moment, this is something that we're definitely going to have to discuss for the Pineland's disaster risk management plan. So this is currently a draft for that plan. And the disaster risk management plan will also be a living document, something that we're going to have to see every year, every 2 years, and see how the conditions have changed or not, and how we can continue to put new lessons learned into that plan. But yes, sea level rise is definitely one of those consequences of climate change that must be integrated into Pineland's disaster risk management plan.
How can people who don't work directly with a site include cultural resources in their resiliency work?
That's also a very good question. Well, if you are interested in knowing more about cultural resources and how to implement them, I guess opportunities like this one, where we can do networking and meet each other, all of us that have common goals in the region, this is when it's important. So if this is something that you want to learn more and you want to see if you want to protect heritage in your resource, and again, not necessarily it has to be a historical structure or an archaeological mound, but you're understanding heritage as the landscape that you're taking care of, then we can definitely have a conversation around that and, collaborate more into seeing how you can apply the different ways that heritage managers in the cultural sector are doing to address all of these challenges with climate change.
What is some physical preparation you plan to do at the site before a storm?
Oh, that's good. So there used to be artifacts at the headquarters, and first things first, you need to take those artifacts out, right? And this is something that not only applies to archaeological sites, if you have offices, so it's kind of the same procedure. Make sure your laptop or your computer is covered, put storm shutters, elevate anything that is touching the ground. So if there's flooding, nothing gets damaged. Again, with mounds, there's not much you can do, but something that is very important is to keep the wilderness intact. So, cut the grass and make sure the trees don't go too crazy, because the first things that impact your site are going to be uprooted trees, or it's going to be random debris. So make sure that that area is as clean as possible so that you reduce the chances of stuff flying through, again, which is kind of tricky when you have a Category 5 hurricane, but those are some of the measures. And again, all of those little details you can put into the map, so that the good thing about hurricanes is that when it's going to come, right? It's not like an earthquake. It suddenly happens. You prepare a few heads, if not a couple of weeks ahead, and you can go, okay, step by step on what I have to do to make sure that my site is clean. Make sure to tell all visitors we're going to be closed because we're going to prepare for the hurricane. And in turn, that helps people get in the mindset, oh, if the Calusa Heritage Trail is closed because they're preparing for this hurricane, I should go home and do the same. No.
Was the mound house at Fort Myers Beach included in the plan?
No. So this plan was specifically for this archaeological site, but this is something that I have also discussed with the people at Mound House, and hopefully it's something that they will also consider doing in the near future, sitting down and again, a disaster risk management plan is a tool that was created with the intention of being part of an overall management plan. It's not meant to stand by itself. So if this is something that you're also interested in doing for your workplace or your natural resource, keep in mind that you need to first work on your overall management plan and then include that this DRM plan for your resource. So at the moment, no, I'm sure that they have some emergency plans on their current management plan. And for those of you who want to visit Mount House, they will reopen in April. So we can go support them.
How can planners identify what sites are in their area? What cultural resource sites are, there's a state database of cultural resources.
Okay.
Is there anything else you recommend that people can utilize to locate where these cultural resources are for the purposes of planning?
So for anybody that works in planning, and if there is the Florida master site file, which is the inventory of all the archaeological sites, historical sites, cemeteries that we have in the state of Florida. So if you have access to that, and I know Lee County and the city of Fort Myers also has access to the Florida master site file, it will tell you right where those are. And if you have any archaeological sites in your overall, if you work at a park, it will tell you if there are any archaeological sites there. If you don't work right for the city or any other organization, and you're interested as a, citizen of Lee County or whichever city you live in, you want to help protect heritage resources, the Florida Public Archaeology Network has the Heritage Monitoring Scouts. So it's a program that we train any person volunteer into helping us document the impact of climate change, mostly coastal erosion and sea level rise, on our heritage sites and historical cemeteries. So if that's something you're interested, you can learn more at fpan.us.
And we have time just for one last question. There's so many good ones. I'm sorry. But if you could stick around, perhaps people can get you.
Of course.
What kinds of practices do first responders or other people responding after in the recovery phase need to think about when they're responding to damaged archaeological sites? Are there any special things that need to be taken into consideration to make sure that as people are responding, first responders, or even people doing long-term recovery should consider when they're entering into these cultural resource sites?
So that's also a very, very good question. So every experience with every site is going to be different, no? And there are accounts of certain archaeological site or heritage sites or national parks that their role after a disaster happens stop being that of a recreational use and becomes a space for shelter or for people to meet and give each other resources. So although heritage as people suffers and we need to provide first aid to a site or a museum or a library or a historic cemetery, heritage also is very important for the recovery of a community overall. So unfortunately here, cultural heritage tends to be at the bottom of the list of priorities. But I believe that if we think about heritage, not of this thing that, we need to take care of it all the time, but also as a tool that can help us be more resilient, and not only can help us in our efforts in the response phase to help other people and overall recovery, we can see that taking care of our heritage sites as soon as the disaster happens will have long-term benefits in our full recovery process. So, and this is what I mentioned, that it's also very important to have conversations with, for example, the county sheriff's department, because again, in case that every member of staff that works at a museum or an archaeological site evacuated and it's not in the area, and there's some sort of emergency, and the police or the fire department are the ones going to that museum or that site, and they're not taught or trained on how to take care, how to remove an artifact from an exhibit, how to clean the area around the mound so that it doesn't impact it, right? And we have artifacts out of context or stuff like that. That's why it's so important to have a two-way conversation on having them involved in the process of taking care of heritage after a disaster or another hazardous event, and vice versa, what we can do to make heritage help people as well regain a sense of normalcy after a disaster happens. So this is why it's so important to also keep our heritage sites protected, because when your landscape is disrupted by something as horrible as a Category 5 hurricane in Southwest Florida, sometimes what helps you psychologically recover is going back to these heritage sites and connecting with nature, no? So it's all interconnected.
Mhm. Well, thank you so much.